You're probably aware that there's been some discussion and debate lately about the progress and impact of system dynamics. I think the pessimism may be a little overdone, but nevertheless there appear to be some issues about the impact that we're having, which has caused me to think about perhaps there are some limitations about how we go about doing system dynamics. So I've been having a look back at our practice to see what we might learn from this. Now, what I'm going to cover is bringing up some issues about the way in which some system dynamics projects appear to be carried out. And from those issues, just go back and think about the general principles that lie behind what we do. And where that gets us to is the possibility that there are standard systems with standard structures out there. I do most of my work in the corporate business field. So I keep on coming across the same kinds of structures in lots of different situations. There is a further implication that there are partial structures for issues that we want to address, but I don't think we'll have time to go into those this morning. So I want to end up by discussing implications for what I'm saying, for the way in which we go about doing system dynamics modeling projects. So a typical process to get a model going is that we start with a reference mode, identifying the outcome of concern and plotting a time chart of what that issue is. The typical process then goes on to seek cause-effect relationships and put together a causal loop explanation as to what we think is going on. From that, we take the causal loop diagram, we identify what the stocks in that diagram are, and the flows that go with those stocks, and then we go off and we look for data to populate this model, to put it into software and build ourselves a working model. And from that, having validated it, we seek useful findings and test policy options to fix the problem that we set out to deal with. But I want to focus on step 2 here. Now, this step in the process, at least as it appears from the articles that are published and from the presentations that are given about the method, this step appears to be qualitative. It's done by wide consultation with stakeholders involved in the issue, and it attempts to map the whole of the domain of the system of concern. Okay, so we're trying to get the whole picture on the board. And where we end up is with what's known as a shared mental model. This is the collective view of everybody involved as to what the structure of this thing looks like. And just looking back through the System Dynamics Review, this also appears to be how we actually present our results. So we start by laying out the problem, and we say, here is the causal loop diagram of this situation. Now let me go on and tell you what the model does based on that diagram. There are variations on this. There is the influence diagram variation, which puts a touch more discipline on the causal loop mapping, and qualitative stock flow diagrams are sometimes used rather than purely the causal loop approaches. There may be others, and there are certainly other approaches amongst our professional practitioners, but this appears to be somewhat typical to the way in which models get built. There are issues arising from this. This requires a lot of time and effort from a lot of people. And simply getting all the stakeholders to agree that this is something they should bother doing is a big enough effort. Then you've got to get them all together. Then you've got to consult with them all. Then you've got to hold workshops purely to get to the causal loop diagram. As a result, the anxiety here is that this delivers limited and somewhat uncertain benefits. We can't be sure until almost the very end what the actual value is going to be from doing this. So we end up with a process that is very costly and in the eyes of some of the clients appear to be poor value. And when we walk away and say, thank you, we've done your project, here's the results, when we walk away, we're pretty sure that they actually don't understand. They see the result and they see the diagram, and they take it on trust that this result comes from that diagram, but they don't actually understand. They couldn't replicate the thing themselves. They couldn't develop it, take it any further themselves. So where do those issues come from? Well, my assessment is that it comes from the features of that process. The first feature of which is that we try and map the whole of the problem space in the first place. We very quickly have to figure out what the boundaries of the problem are, and then we try and map everything inside that boundary, which is a big task. In doing that, we rely on human opinion. We consult people as to what they think the causal mechanisms are. But it is axiomatic to our field that people don't understand the systems of which they are a part. So how do we think that asking people about how the system works, when we know that they don't understand how the system works, is going to give us a good picture of how the system works? And this is done with no attention to data. We do the quantified behavior over time chart, and then we immediately throw it away, and we do this whole process qualitatively. We're simply seeking people's views as to what these things are. We do the quantitative modelling comes later. Now the consequences of all this, the late Barry Richmond, I think he was the member of our community who started the joke at the expense of the economists, who when he looked at an econometric model of milk prices, he's basically concluded that maybe a very fine model about milk prices, the only problem was it did not involve any cows. That's a great joke at the expense of economists. But that we have models of healthcare with no hospitals. We have models of airlines that do not fly any routes between any airports. We have models of insurance companies that do not have any policyholders. We have models of the development of fishing fleets that do not include the price of fish. Now, those models may all be fine for the purposes for which they were intended, the narrow purpose of that particular project, but they cannot possibly represent a platform from which we can produce generalized models of those issues, of those situations. You can't take that model to another client in the same industry and say, here is a model we can start from to help you solve your problem, because we've done it before over here with another client in the same situation. Right. So we end up with no repeatable models. Every project has to start again from nothing, right? Because we're taking the premise that the mental models of the participants is where we should start from. So you can't possibly start from a project which used some other stakeholders' set of mental models. Now this is very, very demanding. Now good projects done this way are extremely demanding, which basically means only the top experts in our field can actually do it. Right? You can't expect a master's student or even a PhD student to do this and get it right. And for that reason, I think this is a significant contribution to the slow adoption of our method. It takes too long, it's too costly, it's too uncertain, delivers poor value. Now there are exceptions to this, and I think the exceptions point to an answer to the issue. The consultants in our field, and there are a lot of pretty successful consultants out there. I know there are a lot who struggle as well, but there are a lot of quite successful ones. They don't do this. They reuse rigorous structures that they've used many times before. I have a colleague who specializes in human resource strategy solutions for clients. He doesn't go through that process at all. He says, here is a standard structure for how a human resource system actually works. What we are going to do is we're going to figure out how it has to be adapted to your situation. It won't be exactly the same. You can't just drop exactly the same model on every situation, but you start with templates. And we've got templates in project management, supply chain, water resources, fisheries, infections, all kinds of things in our field. We know what the template looks like. And we've got many, many common structures that come up again and again in the models that we use. Aging chains, word of mouth, growth under investment, and so on. There's lots of these. So what's going wrong here? Well, Here is a very, very simple case. It's the simplest of the cases I've ever worked on that I can use in order to bring out the issue here. It's a small IT support company. They provide support to small to mid-sized businesses. You know, we're not talking about CSC or EDS here. We're talking about a small regional provider. And this is their problem. Over a period of some 24 months, they saw substantial growth in their customer numbers, but that's peaked and it's now falling away. And over the same period, service quality dipped and is now coming back again. So we do a causal loop analysis of what might be causing this, and this is what we discover. We discover that at the top there should be some reinforcing growth with customers giving us access to new customers. You know, I've done great work for this client, let me do it for you. However, the customers we have generate a demand for work, and limited by the work that we can do at the bottom left, that gives rise to pressure on the staff. Pressure on the staff gives rise to the drop in service quality, and that loses us customers. The problem at the end there, where things are just continuing to get worse, arises because the pressure on the staff also means that it hits the staff themselves, and we lose staff, which means that the work capacity has actually gone down. Okay? So three simple loops, and here is our premise. That structure causes that behavior. But the premise is that simply by looking at that diagram on the left, you can expect to figure out what the behavior is on the right. That's what's being implicitly promised here. And conversely, the opposite promise is that if you show me the picture on the right-hand side, I can figure out what the causal loop structure must be on the left, which I submit is implausible, right? So let's go back to those general principles. What actually underlies what it is that we do? And yes, we do start with a concern to improve performance over time. That's what system dynamics is for, right? It isn't for doing any other kind of problem. It is about improving performance over time. That performance depends at every moment in time on the quantity of the stocks in the system. Okay, this is a repeatable general finding that if you start with any performance outcome and trace back what causes it, sooner or later you have to hit a stock or more than one stock. The only exception is if the performance aim itself actually is a stock. So if your performance aim is to grow the number of customers, the customers is a stock, so we don't have to do step 2. Step 3 is that those resources accumulate. That simply is what they do. It's axiomatic to the way the world works. There are no exceptions. It is mathematically precise. It isn't a statistical finding or observation. It just is the way the world works. And we then need to figure out what drives the flow rates. And what drives the flow rates is one of 3 general categories of item. Either decisions that we take. I hire people. That is a flow rate. I develop new products. That is a flow rate. It's a decision that I've taken. The second category of factor, though, is that external factors may be involved. I hire people, or I try to hire people, but actually other people are trying to hire the same people as me. Those other people trying to hire those staff are an exogenous factor affecting my ability to build that stock of staff. But the third category of factor that drives the flow rate is the existing stocks themselves. And that is where feedback comes from. The fundamental component of our method is not the feedback loop, it is the accumulating stock. So let's apply that method to this case. Here is the service quality that we're concerned about. That comes from the pressure on staff. I'm not putting all the time charts on here, I should do, but for simple ease of reading the diagram, I'm going to leave some of them out. And that service quality comes from the balance between work required and work we can do. Work we can do comes from the number of staff we have, and the number of the work required comes from the number of customers we have. That service quality gives rise to the loss of customers at the top, and the pressure on the staff gives rise to the loss of staff at the bottom. But what we've done is we've put data on this right from the start. And we've carried that performance time chart, the service quality chart there, and we've connected it to other time charts of other factors in the system. Now here is where the decisions sit in this, and typically the people we work with want to know where the decisions are in these pictures, and very often they're quite hard to find in those causal loop diagrams. Where exactly is the decision I'm taking here in this feedback structure? But here are our decisions. How many customers should I go out and try to win, and how many people should I hire? So here is the same statement, structure causes behavior, but now you can see the behavior on the structure, and it's rigorous because it includes explicitly what's happening to the stocks. It's actually not quite rigorous enough, because the flow rates are absolutely critical. If the stocks don't change, performance doesn't change. The only way a stock can change is because of the flows. Therefore, in every system, it is the flow rates that are absolutely critical. Therefore, we should see the time charts of the flow rate. That's where the changes in the performance actually come from. So that's an alternative, and it's no more difficult to get to than getting large groups of people to go away and try and figure out qualitative causal diagrams in workshops. And by the way, there is no reinforcing loop at the top. The initial growth in customers came because the company put in some additional sales effort. So looking at the time chart, you might think that initial growth there was from reinforcing feedback. It wasn't. There is no reinforcing feedback here. Right? But as soon as you show people a word of mouth structure, they definitely want to put it in their causal loop diagram. But there is none. Yeah. So here is here we go. Let's go through the process. Here is the actual time chart for the history of this firm's client base. This is the working model of exactly the same thing. We've got the actual problems on the right-hand side, not some abstract concept of service quality. This is actual problems being experienced by customers. The chart in the middle puts the upper curve is the work required, and the lower curve is the amount of staff hours we have, and those items come from the number of clients we have and the number of staff we have. And there is the actual stock and flow relationship driving changes in the client base. The client base followed that path because of those two time charts on the flow rates. It didn't arise from any other combination of those two. The inflow and the outflow are equally important here, and without both of those you cannot figure out what's going on. And it's quite helpful to reassure people actually that we're not doing anything mystical or complicated here. You could do this on a spreadsheet quite easily. Just put a column for the number of clients and the clients won and the clients lost, and you can just calculate it down. The clients sometimes get the idea that there's something terribly technical and complicated about system dynamics. It isn't. At its heart, it's essentially straightforward. So now we want to know what drives those flow rates. So here is our decisions. So our decisions could be about price, it could be about competition, it could be about the existing stocks in the system, such as product range. The same three categories of factor drive the outflows. So how does that work here? Well, at the bottom, we've got that reinforcing loop around the staff loss structure. So the very bottom stock is the number of staff we have. We're hiring on the left of that stock, and just above that in the middle you've got the chart of the pressure on the staff that comes from the work they can't do. That pressure causes the loss of the staff. So we've got the staff loss rate at the bottom right, and that is indeed a rather unfortunate and damaging reinforcing feedback loop. But the numbers tell you about how strong that reinforcing loop is. At the top, you've got the balancing feedback where the pressure on staff drives the problem rate that clients experience. That gives rise to a fraction of the clients saying, I'm not putting up with this service quality, I'm going to find another provider, and that drives the loss rate. The red chart lines here are actual client data, and the blue chart lines are how the model matches the client data. Making a model match the real world time chart is kind of encouraging, but we shouldn't take that on its own as being an indicator of validity. The rest of the structure has got to work. I remember a quote from Jeff Coyle, who I met early on in my system dynamics career, who said, "A good system dynamics model should do what the real world does, and for the same reasons." And for the same reasons. Okay. Any fool can make time charts match, but not any fool can make the whole system match. And that's what we're trying to do here. There's a really important principle here, a really important observation. Feedback is always caused by a stock being involved in driving its own flow rate. That is what feedback is. And we know that people cannot intuitively understand what a stock's behavior is from changes in its flow rate. John Sterman has done endless experiments on this to show that people simply cannot intuitively estimate stock behavior from information about the flow rates. So how do we think that we're giving people an explanation they can understand of their system if it doesn't include any representation of the stocks in that system? There's a logical inconsistency here. This is a working model. If you go to the URL down there, it's sdl.re/m4a03. Okay, if you go to that URL, you can actually work with this model. So if you put all this together, what you end up with is a picture of the system. The world I work in happens to be business, so it's a business system I'm interested in. And it's a picture of the system that drives performance and it drives its own development through time. And this is a generic model adaptable to any business and any other type of organization. So let me just give you an example of where we get to with this. Pretty much every business I know gets its revenue from customers. So there is a stock of customers in almost every case. Surprisingly, there are some exceptions. If you're in the oil industry, you pump oil out of the ground, you send it to market, you have no idea who bought it, you have no relationship with the customer, and you don't care. All right? But with a few exceptions, every business has customers. Every business has products that are among the factors that cause those customers to want to be customers. They have staff who are engaged in winning those customers, serving those customers, producing the products, getting the products to customers, and they have some form of capacity. And the staff and the capacity must be adequate to meet the demand that's coming from the customers, otherwise sales are unfulfilled, or, as in the IT support case, customers are unhappy and they go away again. And those things on the left-hand side drive costs. Revenue minus costs equals profit. So this is a template that can be adapted for many different situations. Interestingly, I've recently been doing work in non-business settings, and it seems that in many cases a very similar set of standard factors features in other cases too. I don't think I have time to go into that, but that is what we find. And there are some other examples of business models that arise from that process on that slide there. The slides are available. So here's an alternative process. Just the same. Start with the outcome, plot the time chart, now seek the stocks and populate those stocks with time data. Then attach the flows to those stocks and attach time data to that as well. And there's nothing very complicated about this. This is just physics, right? A stock and its flows is just physics. And then seek the stocks, the decisions, the external factors driving that interdependence. Now, when you go through this process, you don't have to wait to the very end for insight to arrive. You get actionable findings in the first half hour from this. Simply saying to somebody, your sales are going down, not because your customers are buying less, but because you're losing customers, is itself a useful piece of information. The second useful piece of information is that you're not losing customers because you're no good at winning them. You're losing them because you're losing more than you are winning. You're actually winning a lot of customers. You're just losing them all again. That's another piece of useful information, within the first hour of the conversation. And if we've done this before, then we already know what the structure is. I've done work with lots of other service companies, so I know that structure is what I'm going to find something like that. I've done work with brand companies, so I know what a brand looks like. I've done work with professional service firms. I know what they look like. So that means that we can do it again, right? And I was struck by a comment by Professor Forrester in an article recently published. Seldom, if ever, he said, should a person model the specific situation of interest, but instead should model the family of systems to which the specific one belongs. Repeatable solutions is what we're looking for. We're looking to be able to replicate our work time and time again, reliably, professionally, and efficiently. So here's the alternate procedure. It's progressive causal analysis, but not with causal loop diagrams. Qualitative diagrams have no contribution to make in this process. With time charts evidenced by data and continually quantified, we model all the way from the first half hour. We don't wait till later to build a model. We model from the start. This results in much less time being spent, much less effort, a continuous stream of specific benefits, much lower cost to the client, and we end up with reliable, long-lived models. That model I showed you is still working for that client. Even though the work was done 5 years ago, it's still the model of how their business works. And it's been repeated for many other client situations. And the big advantage for our young professionals, remember I said early on, it's very demanding to go through the more typical mental model construction process. It's very professionally demanding. You've got to be a very skilled and experienced facilitator to do that, and very persuasive to persuade people even to try to do that. Right? Here, our young professionals can start on this right from the start. Yeah? You can learn your trade very easily this way. And with all that, hopefully we end up with a slightly faster adoption of the method. Okay, we know it is axiomatic to our field that people do not understand the systems they're involved in. So why do we take it that their mental models is the place to start on this process? We know that people don't understand and misinterpret. Yeah, Colin.
I think that comment struck me, and I was thinking, what is it? Forrester, of course, emphasizes experiential information. It appeared in his article in JASA also. And I was thinking that what is it that we are seeking from individuals? System information or something else? And what occurs to me is that in thinking in what Forrester, in terms of what Forrester meant, he specifically asked them what is their role.
Right.
So basically, the experiential information you are seeking is about the person himself, not about his view of the system. And I agree with you that people are ignorant about the system performance.
Right.
But they're very knowledgeable about their own role.
Right.
And that's the valuable information that we use.
Indeed. I'd arrived at somewhat the same conclusion, that we're not seeking people's general view of how the whole system behaves. We're after their explanation about what they actually do. Nevertheless, we know that cognitive bias arises in everything that people do. We all do. I've done it this morning, right? Everything I've said this morning is full of my cognitive bias about how I think the world works. But the only parts of the system about which people can be substantially knowledgeable is the part in which they personally are involved. But you're often trying to answer about parts of systems that none of the stakeholders are involved in. So in my world, there's always a lot of question about how customers behave. So you're asking your stakeholders to give you information about how customers behave. But the only people who know how customers behave are the customers. So if you don't ask the customers, you don't get that information. And furthermore, we know that customers themselves don't know how they behave. They actually misinterpret their own behavior. So we've actually got to go into the data to find out how they actually do behave. So the mental models of people who are involved in the system is not always a reliable basis. But yeah, we should definitely seek their information when we get to that part of the system in which they are personally involved. So in my diagram, when we get to the bit about hiring staff, we should go to the person who hires the staff and says, on what basis do you make the decision that you are going to hire staff? Yeah, that's for sure. I'm not for a moment saying don't consult with people at all, right? Definitely consult with people, but take them the part of the system diagram and ask them to fill in the numbers. Right? So very often when you do that, what you discover is that what they actually do isn't what they say they do, because the numbers don't match their description of their behaviour. We know that people don't understand the behaviour over time from the stocks and the flows. So why do we persist with qualitative diagrams and not put the stocks and the flows in those diagrams? And why do we start the process with a new team from scratch every time? Of course, as I said, many professional practitioners in the field do not do that. But if you read what we say about how you should actually go about the process, that is what we encourage young practitioners to do. And my submission is it doesn't work. Okay. So in terms of presenting what we do, I beat my students over the head over this all the time. They still refuse to do it, but I still beat them over the head about it. Never ever show structure without data. Never show structure without data. The idea that you can show people a qualitative diagram and that tells them anything at all about how the system works is just a fallacy. So never show the structure without the data. In our journal, article after article spends a long time describing and portraying the structure, and then you move to another section of the paper where there are diagrams showing the behaviour. Right? So you've got the structure in one part of the paper and you've got the behaviour in another. How are you supposed to figure out that where this behaviour comes from if it's not actually on the structure? Always make stocks and flows explicit, and build and quantify the analysis step by step. Another wise comment I had from Jeff Coyle was, when building a model, you should never be more than an hour away from a working simulation. My practice since that has been, you should never be any minutes away from a working simulation. You should always have a working simulation of the model at the point you've got to, at all times. It's perfectly possible to do, and you should do it. And yeah, build and quantify the analysis step by step with the people involved. So I think that's about where I wanted to get to. So thank you for your attention. I don't know if I've got any time for questions, do I?
But essentially just want to draw attention to some of the value of the cause loop diagramming, but it's to get engagement, get the stakeholders. And we just had an article, my student, PhD student, Roger Scott, prime author of an article we just got in the System Dynamics Review, showing the value of mental models and alignment a year later. We're evaluating participants in small workshops, and they have gained cognitively from the process of going through it. But if the purpose is to get and build a operational model that works, definitely starting in a different direction. Thanks.
Yeah, let me just respond to that if I can. They get engaged by that too, and this is purely my experience. They get engaged by that actually faster and more substantially, for the very simple reason that it is full of information they recognise. It's full of information they recognise, including data. So if you've got the marketing person in the room, the marketing person sees marketing expenditure and they see sales and they see customers on the diagram. My experience has been that gets every bit as much engagement as a qualitative feedback diagram does.
Yeah, my comment was about your reorganizing the modeling process and bringing in stocks first. And what struck me was Forrester's comment in the last fireside chat.
Yeah.
He said, I always start with the stocks. So I think that's something to think about. You have thrown us a challenge. I was thinking, however, that in this diagram, for example, we have stocks and flows, but your comment about connecting this to the behavior is an important one, and that cannot be accomplished without having a knowledge of how feedback loops individual properties are and how coupled together they behave. So Feedback links at an aggregate level will allow us to link the structure to behavior. And that's where they are important. If you're a large model, for example,
Sure.
you need to do that.
Yeah.
But I think your idea of emphasis on stocks is very thought-provoking.
Okay. Yeah, we are in no way saying that feedback loops don't exist or we shouldn't identify them. They certainly do exist and they should be identified. But in this process, we discover them. We don't go loop hunting. We discover the loops that actually are operating. We don't go looking for speculative loops that we think might be operating. We can, by all means, at a later stage, we can look at this diagram and say, well, is there anything missing here? Right? Is there any causal mechanism that we're not capturing, for example? And clearly in this case, this diagram does not capture the policy feedback. I mean, there's policy feedback that we need to add to this. How did this company decide in the first place to start trying to win clients without thinking about whether it could serve them when it had won them? Right? That's essentially the problem here. So we should certainly add a review as to whether we've actually captured all the feedback that should be, that is actually operating now.
Well, certainly an interesting talk, and I think there are many positive things that can be said about this, and I think you have some historical allies. Many people have argued in the past that stocks and flows matter, that causal loop diagrams are not that important. We shouldn't use causal loop diagrams, and then some people argued just the contrary. They said causal loop diagrams matter a lot. I think it's hard to resolve this discussion. It has not been able, people have not been able to come to a conclusion. I think what's different in yours is that your emphasis on the on dynamic behaviors of stocks as part of your diagram. Now, and I think that's useful. The only risk there is, I think, there are two small risks I think we should be careful about. One is that it gives almost a semantic, perhaps, misinformation about the meaning of the diagram. That is, it looks like when you look at your diagram, it has the normal meaning of a diagram is this: at time point t, x influences y, y influences z. And that occurs at time t. Your diagram that you put as if it was a variable is the end of a long time period. The graph that you put in is the end result.
Right.
At final point t.
Yeah, that's what the model does.
Yeah, so that's what the model does at the very end.
No, that's what the model does all the way through. Those lines are the result of a working model.
I know.
At all points in time, at every point in time.
But can you go back to your previous diagram? To your generic diagram that you showed? Your general diagram, not the model. This one.
That one, yeah.
You see, this diagram, it's unclear semantically what it says. It says that work required at time t influences pressure on staff. Okay? And that occurs at time t. Now, I don't know what the arrow from service quality to the customer stock means. Does that mean that at time t, at any time t, customer stock has that dynamic behavior? That's not true. That's the very ending dynamic behavior of the model, of the working model.
I think you're referring to
the dynamic shape that you show there. The dynamic behavior.
Are you referring to that link there?
Well, and via that link, I am referring to the customer's behavior. That behavior is true only at the final point time t.
No, it's not. It's true all the way through.
Are you saying that that behavior exists at the second point at time t, just after the beginning of the simulation? The
relationship is true at every
That's
point
correct.
in time.
But not the behavior. The behavior is obtained at the very end of the simulation, that behavior.
I don't understand the question.
Well, the pattern that you have drawn
Do you have some?
is not related to the causal.
Let me try to say what Yaman is trying to say.
Okay.
And see if I'm right. Okay. So I could be wrong two ways here, right? If we imagine this picture evolving, So at time 2, the customer blue graph has just begun to grow. And the service quality has just begun to decline. And the staff is pretty constant. And then you blink your eyes and it's now time 4, and there's more of that blue customer graph. And there's more of a decline in service quality. Staff is still going up for reasons known only to staff. But I think Yaman is saying that the picture is semantically, I mean, it's a very, I find his observation sort of deep and confusing, but I think he's totally right. The picture shows as if the simulation has totally occurred. And you are thinking of it as something that is evolving over time.
Now
so
I understand.
I think you're both right.
Now I understand.
How was that? I'm trying to appeal to everybody here.
Yeah. Okay, right. I understand the point. Okay, this picture is looking at the situation at the point in time where we started trying to understand the problem that the client had. If we had been intervening at time 2, then we wouldn't have that problem and we wouldn't be trying to solve it. What we could do is we could help the client anticipate a problem that might arise if they don't do something about it. But this is an attempt to solve a problem which is already in the process of happening. Indeed, it has already happened, and now we're trying to figure out how to get out of it. That's the situation that we're in. But yeah, I take your point. It goes back to Forrester's question about forecasting. We cannot reliably forecast beyond a quite limited time horizon going out into the future. So is that okay?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Kim. The second presenter.